Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om Peace, Peace, Peace. And good evening. We are continuing our readings from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda, one of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, who started the centers in the southern part of India. And we're reading his lecture on, is a belief in transmigration consistent with reasoning? And we noted the last time that among his many lengthy paragraphs in this first section, that we have yet to discuss transmigration or reincarnation. And he's really laying the foundations about the process of how we know things. It was really more about epistemology, you could say. So we are going to backtrack just a little bit so that we're starting where the paragraph starts. If you're following along, it's page 463. There is a great talk. So if you'd like to start there, we will continue.
There is a great talk among some of our modern educated people against this kind of getting knowledge, which they have named transcendental. That is, going beyond the cognition of their five senses and made it as good as unfit to be relied upon. Now, these people will never care to see for themselves by practically taking trouble to go through those processes which enable them to do so and invest them with the power of transcendental sight. Their obstinacy in holding light all such superhuman experiences will serve them nothing better than the obstinacy of the blind man in not believing about the existence of a pit on his way, simply because he himself cannot see it. But fortunately, there is no such obstinate blind man in the world. For every blind man recognizes his own weakness, and therefore is humble enough to ask the help of others. Whereas the so-called experimentalists are blinded by so much vanity that they have no power to detect their own weakness, and deeming themselves to be perfectly right and almost all-knowing, never care to avail themselves of the experiences of higher men, and prefer to die like a common beast, which also believes in nothing but what it directly perceives through one or other of its five senses. It is a patent fact that a learned man sees more in a thing than a common uneducated person, and sometimes the experience of the former leads him to harbor exactly an opposite idea about a certain thing to do what the uneducated possesses regarding it. No scientific man will ever be able to convince a country clown about the truthfulness of the heliocentric theory. To the latter, the sun always goes round the earth instead of the earth going round the sun. But fortunately, there is no such perverse and obstinate clown on this earth as does not admit his own littleness and is not ready to accept the conclusions of those learned people whom he always holds to be much more learned than himself. So an ignorant man has decidedly this great advantage over his blind brother. The pedant, who, poor man, has not been vouchsafed with the divine quality of humility, which alone enables a man to gather more and more knowledge and become wiser. Rainwater, says Sri Ramakrishna, always glides down from high grounds and gathers in lower levels. Similarly, the holy instructions of the sages enter and gather into the hearts of the meek and lowly. They have no place in hearts puffed up with vanity. When Dharma, in the form of a yaksha, asked Yudhishthira how to grow wise, the latter replied, "A man can only become wise by sitting at the feet of his elders and learning from them by pleasing them with constant service." Unfortunately, most of our so-called learned men of the present day lack that humble attitude of mind, and that is the reason why they are far less useful to our society than the sturdy country clown whose honest labor supplies the country with food, who, although rough and rude to look at, is still soft, docile, and humble within.
Yeah, so, and I think we remarked last time, and I'll just bring you back up to date, or perhaps you missed last time, that we all work from certain paradigms, and so our paradigms color how we see things. So if you're doing experiments and you're expecting certain results, if you don't get those results, you might think you've probably just made an error in your experiments, and you might just give up if you can't get the results you like, rather than wondering why you got the results you did and what was wrong with your initial assumptions and paradigm. And this is unfortunately a fairly common problem. We get stuck in paradigms, we get married to paradigms, just as the people of 1,000 years ago were stuck in the paradigm that indeed the Earth was the center of the solar system and everything else went around it. It seemed like such an obvious conclusion when you look up at the sky. It looks like everything's going around us. So that was their paradigm, and it was difficult for them to get out of it. In fact, the scientists that proposed the opposite were ridiculed and condemned by the church and all sorts of things because it went against the prevailing paradigm. And you get the same thing now with funding. We don't burn people at the stake anymore, but we burn them financially. If you want to do experiments in science and you're out to disprove the current paradigm and prove a different paradigm, you won't get any funding. You won't get the time on the telescopes. You won't get the time in the labs. You won't get the money to do the experiments. And so this is the way it goes, and so you end up stuck in it. But just as at the turn of from the 19th century to the 20th century, saw that there were many problems with physics that they simply couldn't figure out, and Einstein had to come up with a solution. Eventually, we do end up switching our paradigms, and so then we have a new paradigm to look at, and we have new problems. And even with the Einsteinian and quantum revolutions, we end up with new scientific problems that we're struggling to understand. And of course, cosmology, we have the Big Bang model. And the Big Bang model has all sorts of problems. And with the James Webb Telescope, it's getting more and more problems. It's got galaxies that are way much too old to be as far back as they're seeing them. And many of the scientists are beginning to think this is time for a new paradigm. We've got the wrong one. But there are others who have invested their entire careers on this one, and they're not going to give it up. So that's the way things go. We also have the same problem with history. And this is still quite controversial because the evidence is still a bit spotty, but there seem to be increasing amounts of evidence that human beings had civilizations further back than we currently recognize in our history books, that the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia and India, which were thought to go back perhaps to say 3,000 or 4,000 BC, seem to go back. Now we see more and more evidence that things may have existed long before that. And of course, the people that have tried to date some of the Indian scriptures, like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, have tried to do that with astrological dating. And they look at the references to how the stars were in the sky, the planets were in the sky during those events, and they try to trace back when those would have happened, and they end up with time scales that are way out of whack from the currently accepted ideas of when humanity got civilized. So it may be that our understanding of history is simply wrong. And maybe there were civilizations a lot older than we thought, but it's going to take a lot more research to find that out. But we can't just sweep all this evidence under the rug and say, well, they're just anomalies and we don't understand them. Eventually, we have to take them all into account and try to see what's going on. Now, of course, what he's coming up against is even trickier, because he's talking about transcendental experiences, and when somebody has a transcendental experience and tries to write about it or teach about it or describe it to others, they may not have any experience like that themselves, so they may just think, well, this person's kind of weird. I don't know what he's talking about. They don't have anything to relate it to. And as Ramakrishnananda is pointing out, they don't want to take the trouble to go through the arduous yogic practices to actually have those realizations themselves. And you have the same problem today with even less esoteric things and spiritual experiences and samadhi, with people that have had near-death experiences. Many times the established community simply doesn't accept them. They think, well, it's just the brain, chemicals in the brain or electrical activity in the brain that's kind of winding down and firing all over the place and creating these impressions. But there's a lot of evidence that doesn't seem to add that, to hold up that particular hypothesis. And so even with those kinds of things, and that you can't really test very well in a lab, you can't ask people to have a near-death experience on command and put 20 people in the near-death experience group and 20 people in the non-near-death. You can't ethically do that. Although actually there have been some unethical experiments where we tried to do that, where people, can't remember what it was they did, took drugs or something to induce a near-death experience. So this is the problem that we have, is these things are not very testable. It's interesting that in the realm of physics, they are beginning to test what you might call psi phenomena, which has been researched for well over 100 years. In the late 1800s, the interest in psi research became quite pronounced. And I think probably because it was becoming clear from the avalanche of scientific investigations that you couldn't take the Bible literally. And so people were looking for some sort of evidence that there was life after death, and that that consciousness was all-pervading, and that there was something to spiritual life that we're not ordinarily aware of. And that because they couldn't just rely on the words, literal words of a scripture, and they didn't understand how to take them more symbolically and so forth. So there's been a lot of research there, but now with computers and so forth, there's been more research that have indicated that there does seem to be a reality to psi phenomenon, things like psychokinesis and affecting other people's minds at a distance and so forth. And again, these are not 100% results, but they show that there's a statistical leaning. You can have a statistical leaning of getting more heads than tails, or getting more ones on a computer than a zero on a computer, and that type of thing. It's not that you're going to get all ones or all heads, but you can statistically skew the results with people's mental efforts. And so this kind of phenomenon is being documented. Or showing pictures to one person in one room and having a person in another room pick up those images and drawing something similar. So all of those kinds of experiments are being done now. So we actually have some ways of testing some of these, what used to be transcendental type of experiences. All right, let's continue with his writings here.
There was a time when the noble-hearted and aspiring young children of India had that noble kind of humility in them, which led them to believe in the words of her sages, so much so that they believed more in the latter than in themselves. And in course of time, those very young men lived to be sages themselves, leading and exhorting in their turn another band of young men to reach that eminence. India was in her flesh time then. Those glorious days may again return, if instead of neglecting and looking down upon their ancient sages, the modern young Indians learn to revere them and sit at their feet to learn. The reasoning based upon the knowledge gathered by believing in the experiences of these superhuman beings, these gods on earth, these old sages of ours, is called the Gama, or the scriptural testimony. These divine experiences are surely much more ennobling than the lower experiences through the organism. If we are meek, wise, and fortunate enough to put our entire faith in the experiences of our sages, we will not at all find it difficult in believing in the transmigration of soul, which they all unanimously hold, and we will find this present life of ours only a tiny chapter in a big volume whose beginning as well as end is the one eternal God, who is the permanent background of all this immense and eternal universe, which rises, exists, and dissolves in him, to rise, stay, and vanish again and again. Then, if I be wretched and downtrodden, kicked and tyrannized, I will never fail to find consolation in the thought that better days are yet in reserve for me in a future state of existence. Then death will lose its sting, and instead of fearing poverty, I will gladly court its embrace, hoping for better days. Then men and women will struggle hard to lead moral and pious lives, which alone can give them all peace and bliss. So the best proof for the reincarnation of the soul, sanctioned by higher reasoning, is the testimony of the sages.
Yes, certainly it's very important to learn from the elders. This is something which, of course, has been passed down for generations and generations. However, it's also to be noted that we should always want the pupils to be able to rise above the level of the teacher. Now, if you're a completely realized soul, an avatar, it would be difficult for the student to rise above that. But ordinary teachers are teaching more ordinary people, and hopefully they will be able to learn what they can from the elders and then surpass them, or learn more techniques or more truths. Just as a very mundane example, I hybridize camellias, and I read what other hybridizers have done, because I want to learn from them how, what works and what doesn't work. And I could look through the literature and find out what kind of crosses have been made in the past and which ones have actually yielded results. However, occasionally you read things that if you had taken them at face value and lived completely by their words, you might have missed something. For example, one hybridizer in one climate claimed that a particular camellia was completely sterile and never set seeds. I hadn't read that first and had tried some process on it, and I got some pods, and I asked the Nuccios, who are the prime growers down here, and they said, yeah, I've gotten pods on those too. So for some reason, this individual in his particular climate found that this particular variety did not set seed, but down here in the Southern California, we don't seem to have trouble getting it to set seed. So you want to learn from other people, but you don't want to get stuck in their mistakes either, or things that might be different from them or you. We're all very different people, and so we're all starting from slightly different places, and so our paths are all going to be slightly different. So learn from the sages, take their work seriously, but don't be afraid to also occasionally perhaps think for yourself. And as many of the sages have said, that your true guru is your inner guru. Your inner Atman is your truest guru. And for most people, their guru passes away long before the student passes away, and you're left on your own. And so, of course, they are there to guide you, even if they're not physically in the body. And perhaps in that state, they're even wiser than they were when they were in the body. And so your true self can communicate with their higher self and get even more inspiration from them. All right, so let's continue. Boy, we've got to actually get a short paragraph now.
We can have no direct perception of any state previous to our birth or subsequent to our death, as the organisms with which we are to perceive have no existence before or after our present life. So this kind of lower experience has no power to unravel the mystery connected with our conditions beyond this life, and the higher experiences of the sages alone can furnish us the most conclusive proofs regarding palingenesis. Now let us turn to the other proof left to us. I mean the proof by inference. Much of our knowledge we always gather from the inferential process, although it may not be certain in many cases. The life of inference lies in the belief in uniformity of natural laws, as we've already seen. Experience helps this belief, which in its turn helps the belief that they are indissolubly connected with one another in human nature and enable us to get all our earthly knowledge. Beyond this earth, they cannot safely lead us. So it is impossible to get through inference a full and satisfactory proof about a thing which transcends this earth. And does not the question which we are going to discuss go beyond this organism and the universe reflected in it? But however, let us see how far inference will help us in understanding the transcendental experience of the sages.
Yeah, and of course now we have testimonies of people that you wouldn't call sages, but there are many, many people who remember past lives. And so if you take their evidence as serious, then you have to think that there's certainly a good possibility that we have all had past lives. And it's interesting when you look at all of these cases, and there are many books that have been written on it with hundreds of cases, some of them very detailed and some of them rather kind of not all that convincing. But there are many of them that are very convincing. And many of the cases that are currently being studied result with children that Well, it happens in various ways. Some of them have traumatic dreams, and the parents have to try to figure out why they're having all these traumatic dreams. And they get information from the kid, enough information to track down the person that they actually were in a previous lifetime. Some a pilot that died in a particular battle in a war, or something of that nature, or died in the Twin Towers disaster, or the Oklahoma City bombing, and so forth. There are other times when the person didn't have a tragic, traumatic death, but they just have this weird obsession with something. And they're trying to figure out why they have this weird obsession. And they are able to track down a previous life that seems to match their experiences. There was an incident where this one young girl, from a very young age, just seemed to know how to do makeup. She would use makeup on herself as though she were an expert at it. And she was just a little girl. And she was obsessed with old Hollywood movies and old Hollywood pictures and pictures of stars and so forth, especially if they died young. And eventually she saw a picture of a young movie star that had died very young, and it just dawned on her, that's me. That was me. I was that person. And then she started having all these memories of being that person, and they were able to validate those, and they went back and visited somebody who was doing a book on that star that had died so tragically. And it was quite a fascinating thing. So that was an interesting case where she was just kind of had an obsession, and she had certain talents.
Do you have a name?
I don't remember it at the moment, but she had a name.
She was well known.
Yeah, she died very, very young. She was one of these child actors that, who played roles beyond her years, and she died at something like age 16 or something. So it was very tragic. Somebody had gotten her pregnant, and then she had I think she had an abortion, and she got ill, and they worked her to death. She did something like 6 movies in 1 year. It was just crazy. So she basically died from exhaustion and having an abortion. And she remembered all that. And she remembered who had done it to her. It wasn't the person that a lot of people thought it was. So, yeah. Very interesting. And there are other cases where people just have these unusual talents. A little kid who knew how to whittle arrowheads and knives and use knives and things with no training at all. And of course, we have incidences where people pick up playing a musical instrument and learn much more quickly than anyone would expect them to learn. In most of those cases, I don't think any of them remembered being a musician in a past life. But this little kid eventually had the feeling that he had been in a particular tribe and that had done all these things. So, very interesting. So, the people that remember their past lives usually do it because of some obsession or because of some tragic death. But again, you can't, just because they've had that experience doesn't necessarily mean some people will understand it. In most of the cases, the parents were very understanding, and they wanted to help their kids. They didn't want them to have obsessions or panic attacks or nightmares for unexplained reasons. And usually once they were able to understand what had happened to them in a past life, they got over these things. There was a case where a little girl absolutely screamed bloody murder every time the poor mother went shopping. She would not want her mother to leave her. She just was hysterical. And they traced this back to where she had been separated and her family had been killed and she had been separated and so forth. And there was a book written about her. It was something her interesting enough. Her name was Olivia, and the lady that she'd been in the past life was Olive Oatman. So what are the chances of the parents picking the name Olivia. So very, very interesting case. So, all right, well, let's continue here.
In the first place, we have seen that something can never come out of nothing. The living and conscious human organism is something. Therefore, it must have come from something. Where was it previous to its birth? It was in the womb of the mother, in a subtle state. Where was it previous to its coming into the womb? It was in the father in germ or seed state, as in the mustard-like seed of a banyan tree. The future gigantic tree lies concealed. So in the seed of the father, the future man or woman with all his or her activities, physical and mental, lies concealed. Whence has the seed come? It has come from the Father. It was in the Father, nay, it was the Father himself, previous to its birth. So the present living and conscious organism was at one time moving and living as its Father, the author of its being. Similarly, the organism of that Father was in his Father, and so on. So if a living man traces his origin, he will find it to be carried behind to an infinite series of existences. Hence it is clear that a living man is really existent without beginning. He does not begin to exist from his birth, but he has been living from time without beginning. If we hold that all things proceed from God, then the man that is living and moving before you was at one time in God. Nay, was God himself, as by hypothesis there was only one existence, one without a second. And if God is without beginning and end, the man before you is also without beginning and end. What though he may not have any issue? He as God is living through eternity. As the tree remains latent in the seed, and still no tree is visible in it, similarly, the man in the seed state is altogether unmanifested and unconscious. Previous to this state, the seed was the same as the Father, and therefore at that time it was manifested and conscious. So manifestation and consciousness are preceded and followed by their opposites, which in their turn are preceded and followed by their opposites. As the day follows the night follows the day, in that eternal being, man, consciousness, and unconsciousness eternally follow each other. The intense love of parents for their children clearly proves that they are in no way separate from their children. The child is sick, the parents suffer much more than the child sometimes. And when it is impossible for a suffering baby to take medicine, the doctor prescribes it to the mother, who takes it herself and suckles the child with the milk of her breast, thus medicating. If we consider all this, we cannot help concluding that the children are the other selves of the parents. Thus we have seen how from God the man springs, and to God at last he is destined to go. This is one answer to the question whether the soul transmigrates or not.
Of course, this is really more talking about DNA being transferred on forever. And when you think of it, the mitochondria have been existing in us from the beginning of humankind, and humankind's evolved from other living beings. And so that mitochondria goes back all the way. And so that's really kind of what he's talking about here. And the DNA that you have has been passed on from generation to generation to generation. Of course, many of you have probably done these genetic tests, and they can trace through the mitochondria, the mother's line, and through the Y chromosome, the father's line. And so you can find out the various groups of people that you're most related to. But those genes have been, and mitochondria have been passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on. So that's quite different from the idea of reincarnation, in a sense. It's another idea of things moving from one generation to another, but it's not the same as being reincarnated. Interestingly enough, there are cases where people remember being a relative in the same family. For example, one lady's brother died tragically in a car accident, and when she had a child that was then remembered being that brother of hers that had died. And the reason, all sorts of evidence just kept cropping up. One day he just suddenly turned to her and called her by a name that nobody else called her except her brother. And he remembered going and visiting, seeing an airplane, and nobody in the family had visited this airplane except that brother. The father had taken that particular brother to see that airplane. And so several things like this. And then he had a sleepover with his grandmother and asked for his old teddy bear or something, one of these stuffed animal of some sort. And the grandmother just nearly flipped. She had no idea. The mother had been hinting that this kid is probably her brother, but the grandmother didn't believe it. Then when the kid asked for this toy that she had saved from, then she said, "Okay, I guess I'm going to have to believe this." There's no other explanation. Nobody else would have known that I still had this toy stored up in the attic. So occasionally you do find relatives that are born back into the same family. But that's different from what he's talking about here. He's really talking about genes and so forth being passed on. Now he's going to talk about Darwin here. So let's go ahead and read about Darwin.
The evolution theory of Darwin is a mere guess, for no experiment has yet been done to show that a flying fish can be converted into a bird. And even if it be taken for granted, we will have to admit that something must have been involved beforehand to bring about the later evolution. The amoeba, with numerous changes of forms into which it can throw itself, presupposes the involved power in a previous state. Otherwise, we will have to admit something coming out of nothing, which is absurd. Nothing is lost here in this universe. This is a scientific truth. When we admit the existence of a certain thing, it must have existed without a beginning, is going to exist forever. So if the amoeba has developed itself through a series of onward transformations into a man, the man must have been involved in it. And if the man is destined to become an angel, and if the angel is destined to lose himself in God, and thus be God, God must have been involved in the amoeba to be evolved again. This may be another hypothetical explanation to palingenesis.
Yeah, so that's really probably the easiest way to understand that is to think that consciousness is in there from the word go. Brahman is Sat Chit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. It simply exists. It is, it's the nature of being, and it's the nature of consciousness. And since it's the nature of consciousness, it's involved in everything in this world, which we're seeing through the lens of Maya. We're seeing it through time, space, and causation, but that doesn't change the fact that we're seeing Brahman in there. Brahman has to be in there, so consciousness has to be in there, and it's so it manifests through all these different forms. And so the ultimate reality exists even in the lowest forms. It's interesting when you look at the history of the globe as the best that we can determine through our scientific endeavors, that life has had quite a bumpy ride through the eons, starting with simple bacteria and then all sorts of life forms that existed in an anaerobic existence in the oceans. And then the cyanobacteria began, and they started converting sunlight into sugars and throwing off oxygen as waste. And so, because the atmosphere didn't have oxygen in it before then, and all the organisms were existing in an anaerobic state. And then they threw out all this oxygen, and so that created an enormous die-off of things that could not survive in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. But then it produced a huge flurry of new organisms that could exist in an oxygen-rich environment. And plants settled up on the land and converted all the soil, created all the soil, created more oxygen into the environment, and took a lot of carbon dioxide out of the environment, which then cooled the planet. So you get all these interesting cycles. At one point, a couple of times, the Earth has been a giant ice ball in a huge ice age, and life had to survive in the depths of the ocean, perhaps near thermal vents. Or, of course, we know now that bacteria live in icy realms. They have very, very, very slow metabolism, but they are existing even in these very cold environments. So, through a combination of efforts, these organisms are able to survive these extremes. They're called extremophiles because they live in extreme environments. And so we find that life is very, very persistent. And you have to ask, why is life so persistent? Well, it's because consciousness is in there, and it wants to be the infinite, undivided, unchanging reality. And it tries to do it by manifesting higher and higher organisms. And it gets beaten down by climate changes, and then it rises up again with greater diversity than it had before. So we usually, after a great cataclysmic event, perhaps the snowball Earth, or the first one was the creating of the oxygen-rich environment, and then the snowball Earth, and various other events like the various asteroid impacts and so forth. And these events wipe out huge numbers of organisms, and then after that there's a huge explosion of new organisms to take their place. And the only logical explanation for that is this persistent push of the infinite, undivided, unchanging reality through Maya is trying to manifest greater and greater manifestations as a living organism. So next week we will continue. Just as a heads up, on June 16th, we will only be doing the class remotely. There won't be an in-person class because I will be out of town, so we're going to pre-record it, and it will be broadcast at the usual hour for all of the people that join on YouTube, but there won't be an in-person one, so don't show up at the temple on June 16th. There won't be anything happening. All right, let's close with a chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all yet is still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace. And thank